This is the second part of our conversation where we keep exploring the larger questions into the future of humanity and also where we come from. Thank you so much for being with us. Let's continue. Yeah, I mean, probably maybe loss of human story. I mean, I don't see any human story right now. There's just, as you can see, physical and also, mental factions exist, and
Mm.
technocrat, highly rational, and the science which is turning a bit towards, again, this ideological, religious, omnipotent kind of solution providers. I mean, of course, all of us and the different characters should have a seat on the table, but shouldn't. I mean, it looks like that they are the only ones at this point who have the seat on the table,
Mm.
and we maybe it's another, just a side effect of, we, you can say, divorcing ourselves from older myths and the confusions, and we actually maybe divorced some part of that self which connects us to our own story, and also to the capacity we have, and how dangerous we can be. And by looking at it, we can actually understand that what acts can impact and connects us to the nature. And again, of course, I'm not talking from a religious point of view, but again, these limiting modalities where you can't talk about self and soul or whatever the vocabulary is,
Mm.
it's again damaging in a way that, as a human, you just don't know at this point, as a storyteller, or how our language has developed, that who really we are. I mean, just tons of social overwhelm, anxiety for general people, where they just compare yourself with 7 billion people all the time, try to have these echo chambers, and that's just the dominant narrative, rather than aligning ourselves with our environment and the forces and accepting it. That, I mean, or letting go. Maybe this epidemic, you see, like, there's an epidemic of control also, um
Mm.
around
I think,
around
yeah, I mean, I think things are very tribal.
Yeah.
We split back into tribes, which is quite interesting because if you look to our origin, I mean, and if you look to indigenous communities of whom the relations with the wider world are in effect severed. So if you were to look at some of the more remote tribes of, for example, the Amazon, you actually find there's a very coherent sense of identity. And they're, generally speaking, although they are typically sort of a la colonialism, portrayed as having a very simplistic view of life. If you look to the mythologies and if you look to the belief systems of these indigenous peoples, they're actually very sophisticated. They're highly layered. They exhibit a profound understanding of the systemic nature of life. Structurally, they all have, well, certainly all they that I have studied have correlations. There are, certain narratives that come up time and again. Such, for example, as the idea that in the possession of knowledge, the acquisition not only of the control of fire, but of knowledge more generally, there comes a price, and it's a price that is eternal, and it is a price that is great. And in that sense, the myths, and of course many world religions, their attempt essentially is to imbue a sense of responsibility, a sense of the responsibility that comes with knowledge. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have societies that are they are very diversified, they are very big typically, and they have fractured. And it does seem they are fracturing yet more in that not merely is it the case that we have polarized societies now, but within and of those polarized societies, we have even more fracturing. So, for example, if we looked at the sustainability community, on the one hand, we have they that believe that, yes, we should, and this is my belief, as it were, this is my way of operating, that think it imperative that we have everyone at the table and we listen to everybody and we try to understand everybody's perspective and we try and find the correlations, we try and find the areas of contention, and we try and navigate a compromise. And in that sense, we recognize that there is inherent logic in the views of everyone, because even they, that are actually typically portrayed as being anti-environment, often they have an inherent logic. There's a reason why they think the way they do. Then at the other end of the spectrum, we have what is actually a very bourgeoisie perspective, and that we have that imagine that there are, as it were, the truth keepers, and that those individuals ought dictate what everyone else should do. And it tends to be a very dogmatic approach. So it tends to be all about you shouldn't. So you shouldn't fly, and you shouldn't own a car, and you shouldn't do this, and you shouldn't do that. And that in itself it's a very insular approach, in that it tends not to actually accept that these issues are very complex. I mean, it's a very complex issue as to whether or not there is a rationale to fly or not. I would argue that if it's for a trivial purpose, or if you're flying a lot, then you should re-examine your travel. I'd argue there is actually a rationale for that. But then again, if we all stop flying, there are profound and awful repercussions from that, be it that, many loved ones would not get to see one another, cultures would become yet more insulated, yet more cut off, critical supplies for science and medicine and so forth would not be able to reach their destination in the time required in order for certain experiments and medical procedures and so forth to occur. So these things are really very complex, but the sustainability community in and of itself, they're often portrayed as being a unit, as being a solid, delineated group of people, is incredibly fractured. And that same story is now manifest across many facets of society. And it's causing problems. And as you say, we have no common story as a species right now. I mean, ironically, you could argue, if you actually expand the timeline, and if you look at us from an anthropological perspective over, not mere years or tens of years or centuries, but over epochs, then yes, we absolutely have a story. But right now, there is a loss of story, and that is playing out in many different ways. And what it means is that there is, yes, there's a lack or a confusion over identity. There are disputes over who it is that we are, what it is that we should be doing. And I think the question of reconciling that is incredibly difficult, because, of course, the concept of the internet, the reason that many were so eager to create the internet and to develop this global net, this global communication platform, was because the idea was, it would make the world smaller, and it would enable us to communicate with our fellow man and to exchange information en masse that supposedly would bring us together. It would supposedly make us more united. But actually, when we look at the world today and across the journey of, the period since the advent of going online, of the birth of the World Wide Web, that is not true. In that, what has instead happened is that we've reconfigured, wherein we're still every bit as tribal as we once were, but we've just slightly moved, the parameters of how those tribes are formed. So instead of necessarily being tribal within and of our geographic space, i.e. the people that we're meeting or we would have been meeting day to day, we're now tribal with groups that we've met online or in some other digitally facilitated context. And it is an incredible mess. There are some incredibly unfortunate things coming from it. And, I think it is an extremely important area to research and to try to gain understanding on. But, from my perspective, I really don't have much of an idea, to be honest, as to how the dickens we actually do reconcile it, because as is, I think we're in a very bleak place.
Yeah, I mean, uh, I can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. So, I mean, this actually, when you're talking about environmentalism, that how there's a bit of a separation in this movement where there's a purity of s- you know staying with the local solutions and minimum technology, but then there's some of the people who are maybe leading at some point, they're like, well, you know what, it's coming, we can't really resist it, so probably be part of it, and soften the edges of this issue. And they're saying, okay, yes, even relying on these big corporations, without it, the technology wouldn't the type of technology which could be used to save probably the environment, requires a level of this hungry unlimited growth metropolis places. So there's this conflict, and then overall we as a human and our relationship with the environment, we have an issue of, at first, separation, which is just
Mm.
like everywhere, and then we are now trying at some point also reconcile ourselves with these ideas like animism, but more, not more like fairy tale, but more evolved, maybe trying to be a bit more grounded, that it's not about us, and it's nothing to do with anthropocentralism. But the problem still, and another level on the top of it, even though we are trying it, it's still, we do have the technology, and it kind of makes us a bit powerful, a bit omnious at points. So there's like a lot of issues going on, and on the top of each other. And I don't know, what is it, our urge to understand complex system and then control it still? I mean,
Well, I think, if there is a positive, often when I don't have an answer, the first place I look is to history usually. And if we look back through the history, of the recorded history of humanity, what we know from that, and particularly this past several hundred years, is that we go through periods when, I mean, there's always a wrestle. There's always a wrestle between what is essentially the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, either haves and the have nots. And that, well, I mean, it's certainly a problem that goes back as far as the written record. Although there are, if we look to the Bronze Age, there were certain peoples that, if you like, had a more equitable society than we do today, in that they were better able to distribute wealth in a way that was fair. That said, that was typically happening when resources were abundant and the environment was in quite a stable, relatively stable state. However, again, if we look to the East, again, the history of China, there were periods when China was relatively um, peaceful and collaborative with its, both within and of itself and with its immediate neighbors. And then there were, in contrast to that, there were periods of warfare. And essentially, there's been this sort of bouncing to and fro when, we go through periods when we're getting along rather better, and then we go through periods when we're not. But I think if there is a glimmer of hope in the current situation, it's that if we were to look back to perhaps the closest proxy we have to now, which might perhaps be the 1300s or the 1600s, when Britain, and indeed around the world, but I'm focusing on Britain because that's the period historically that I tend to pay a bit more attention to with regard to this issue. Um, there was extreme inequality, and there was a lot of conflict, particularly, for example, if we look at the early 1600s. We had essentially gone through a period in which, of course, having the discovery of America and, if you like, the age of adventure, when Portugal and Spain and Britain and France and so forth were going out around the world. They were claiming territories. They were claiming the assets of peoples over which, really, technically, I mean, ethically, they had no right, but they obviously inflicted themselves on these other places, and they took their assets. They used that money, if there was a silver lining, they used that money to fuel the Renaissance and to fuel the golden age, as it were. And then after, having done that, the 1600s came along, and a period of great environmental hardship, extremes of heat, hot weather, of droughts, against extreme cold events, and of course with that the pandemics and so forth. And history, the history makes apparent that society started to become more fragmented. British society was yet further diverging. There was a lot of anger, there was a lot of resentment, and of course the Civil War occurred. The King Charles came to an end, and we tried to restructure. Britain tried to restructure, and to what extent it did, because of course, having then revolted,
Hmm.
we then re-embraced the inherent hierarchy. We embraced monarchy once more. But there was nonetheless this breaking point at which society, or rather they that had been disenfranchised, said, enough is enough. And we are going to use whatsoever means that are at our disposal to build a more equitable society, and to challenge that, which is unfair. And I think that is happening now, although it's happening in a way that is less clear to delineate than back in those times, because of course we have got a more complex society. We are living in a world, I mean, to an extent that was a globalized time, and that we were traveling all over the world. We were bringing in goods and supplies from all over the planet. And so it was in effect a globalized era then, but it's more so now. um, and yeah, I mean, on the surface of it can be quite hard to sort of decipher what's going on. But I do think there is a bit of an uprising, and I do think that, as in the 1600s and back in the 1300s, it is coming in waves. It's not a one-off event; it's a series of events. And I think probably about maybe 70 years from now, we'll be able to obviously we'll probably be gone by then, but people will be able to look back and they'll be able to unravel what was going on and say, well, yes, we'd reached the tipping point and the system was set to reconfigure, and through a variety of process it did, and these are some of the positives that came out from that. And so I guess my view is that yeah, there are challenges, but there are signs that within and of that there are probably some much needed reconfigurations that are going to occur. But of course, in and of themselves, they're difficult processes, and they invariably involve some fractions of the community suffering, or being exposed to a greater level of threat and discomfort than is desirable.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, as there are in our personal life, there are moments where you can face the challenge as a species. Hopefully we can face the challenge and transcend, and I'm sure maybe there are some ways how life is tested, and yeah, either we perish or we transcend and be able to connect to our deeper wisdom. But okay, now a little bit of a different topic. So you wrote about a fragment of our prophilic past, if I'm pronouncing it
Mm.
correct. I mean, what is this? Yeah, I want to
Pyrophilic. It's a word I've actually
pyrophilic.
coined. So it's
Okay.
that word. Pyrophilic is essentially, you'll know of biophilia and you'll
Yeah.
know of biophilic. So
Yeah.
biophilic is obviously relating to that which is embracing of nature, or of a concept of nature. So pyrophilia is a word I've coined to essentially convey an acceptance of fire as a fundamental and integral aspect of the functioning of life on Earth, of our world.
Okay. So, but is this the story which you were writing about the palm tree in Australia? I mean, I actually want to know about it. Is this the same thing I'm talking about?
Oh yeah, well that's actually relating to myths. It wasn't me that was writing about the palm tree. It was David Bowman, who was one of the foremost fire ecologists on Earth. So I can't even remember how many papers he's authored. It's something like, it's in excess of over 550 papers, books, and other publications. He
Wow.
is the oracle on fire ecology.
Wow.
And one of the an interesting paper that he published with some peers a couple of years ago, interrogated the possibility that an Aboriginal tale of how the only native palm in Australia came to be in a certain place. And what they did is they decrypted, in effect, the mythological tale through the lens of fire ecology. Now, that is a general approach to mythology that has been building an interest of the past, well, it's now a couple of decades, wherein there are whole research teams that are, for example, looking for correlations between mythological accounts of geological and other environmental events and reality. And that actually has uses both from the perspective of understanding how ancient peoples perceived of their world, but also in terms of trying to date the origin of mythological tales. And therefore, there's an inherent anthropological and wider research value to attempting to decrypt, is there a correlation? That is something that I picked up on and that I followed through in the thesis, and that I interrogated the origin of fire myths. And my theory, in fact, or my hypothesis, because it's not proven, and indeed it's such a complex field that is dealing with such ancient data, as it were, that it may never be proven. But my hypothesis is that the origin of fire myth is born of real world observation. And the reason for this is that when we look to the fire myths about the world, of which there are very many in different cultures, we find that, like language, they have, for example, like the Indo-European language, they have common structures, they have commonalities in their narrative, they have common characteristics in terms of the attributes that are affiliated to key characters, to key components of these myths. And with relation to their discussions on fire, certainly with respect to, you mentioned Prometheus. Now, of course, Prometheus was said to have stolen fire from and knowledge of fire from Athena and Hephaestus, and of course the other character in that trio was Zeus, the if you like, the king, the god of the gods. And looking at that myth and tracing it back through to pre-Socratic times, both the poetry of Sappho and the Athenians and the earlier groups that essentially explored and authored mythologies around that particular tale. There are similarities with the origin of fire myths of other cultures in India, in South America, and so forth. And because of the fact, we know that these tales are very ancient, as I said, structurally, these myths, and narratively and in terms of meaning, these have commonalities, which, if we were to apply the same principles as etymology, i.e. how and why language evolved as it did, we'd be looking at a common origin. We would be looking, in order for there to be these similarities in structure and meaning and so forth, we'd be looking at a point of common origin, which, if we are to trace our known or the known movements of humans as they spread out around the world and as these cultures formed, and obviously we know a fair amount about the origins or the date, as it were, of arrival of certain peoples in certain parts of the world, suggests that these origin of fire myths have they have a common source, or they have one of a limited number of common sources that predate the migration of these peoples and the evolution of their cultures. Because, of course, in that process, as with language, there are modifications that are made. So, for example, one of the things I've identified is that though, for example, different species are referred to, or, obviously different names and different incarnations of objects of which the purpose is the same, for example, a torch or a fennel stick, but the incarnation, if you like, is modified to be bespoke to that culture, i.e. to the sort of tools or names or sort of things that had evolved within that particular community over time. And if that is true, as in, as in the case, if there is truth in this hypothesis, as with Bowman's hypothesis, or indeed it's now proven as theory, that the origin of the palm tree, the native Australian palm tree, does in fact correlate with the Aboriginal myth story, then that has profound implications, because what that is saying is that these mythologies, they are more than just tall tales. They are in effect what you might think of as a system of communication, which, a little like a scientific paper today, is structured in such a way that it's conveying important knowledge. It's conveying information that is fundamental to these persons, these communities, understanding of the world. And certainly, again, in order that we, to add another layer of understanding to where I'm heading with this, different cultures, obviously, they not merely adapt their language, so the actual wording that they use. And I've spoken a bit to the etymology actually in the thesis discussion. But of course, they also use symbolism. They use symbolism in terms of iconography. They use symbolism in terms of numerology. And if we look at it on that level, not just in terms of the narrative and the meaning and so forth, but we find that there are structures, there are symbols that are coming up time and time and time again. And so in that context, mythology itself has an evolutionary story that, if understood, enables us to understand how human culture and how human belief systems actually evolved. And with that, I mean, if we were to bring in a couple of the other theorists on this, I've spoken at length about the work of a chap called Terence Turner. Now, Terence Turner will be known amongst they that are very attuned to Indigenous rights, to human rights, and to the efforts to protect Indigenous communities and their interests around the world, because he essentially was extremely active in that regard for many years and undertook some very notable works. But Terence Turner was actually an anthropologist that essentially carried on the work of Levi Strauss, and actually within of the same region in the Amazonian forest, the Amazon forest. And he added another layer to Strauss's work, in that whereas Strauss had only really looked at the structure of mythology, Terence Turner actually really got into the meaning. And so he took, as it were, the vessel of understanding that a little bit forward. He actually spent a number of decades in the Amazonian forests with particular communities to decrypt their mythologies. And in his work, essentially what he's done, and this again is a point that I've picked up on and discussed, he essentially emphasized how, I mean, not in so many words, but he essentially spoke to the fact that understanding of mythology, until relatively recently, was very much tainted by colonialism and by the elitist global north narrative, the idea that other peoples are primitive, other peoples are savage, to use the Levi Straussian term. And, Turner's work really, his book came out, it's well worth the read. It came out just a couple of years ago. I actually I edited it in latterly into the thesis, actually, because originally the book had come out so very, very recently to when it essentially went to print pretty much at the time I was submitting. So I hadn't really had time to craft that discussion with any depth. So that was one of the edits I made. I actually bumped in Turner latterly before the final submission. But he built on this theme, and I too have spoken to the fact that when we think to mythology, when we think also to myth, to legends, and to really all forms of communication of knowledge of other peoples, of indigenous peoples, and of ancient peoples, we really need to be aware of our prejudices. We really need to be aware that actually, just because we don't understand the way in which these narratives are structured, just because the symbolism is alien to us, just because the relations that these mythologies have to others, in that when you look to the mythologies of the ancient world and indeed of extant indigenous peoples, the mythologies, they're not standalone. You can think of them almost like a soap opera, in that they are related to an ongoing narrative. In order to really understand one mythology, you need to you need to read, and you need to know the narratives of they that relate to it. And of course, the bigger that matrix of mythologies that you then understand, and in turn, the better your understanding of the characters and the symbols within and of those mythologies, the better your understanding of the language that is in use, and the better your understanding of the meaning. And that, I think, is really important. And some people may, wonder, well, why on earth would someone that was really trying um, to challenge the contemporary approach to fire, the idea that we need to control it, we need to eradicate it, we need to remove it from um, as much of our wild landscapes and so forth as possible. The common sort of narrative of the popular media. Why would one dig into these ancient mythologies? Why would one dig into the indigenous beliefs? And the reason is very simple. If we don't understand how other people understand fire, if we don't actually recognize how our own ideologies differentiate from others, and over time, then ours is a very limited understanding of how and why we came to be where we are. In that, we have to compare, we have to see where the differentials are in order to really get to the roots of how we arrived at the place that we're at. And so, yeah, it's a piece within a piece, and I don't know quite where I will take the mythologies discussion, but certainly in terms of how much there is to research, I've since reviewed my own work. In fact, I've been back through my own thesis, and I've written various notes and observed things that I actually hadn't observed in the original authorship. And so I've already built it out. And, I would hope that there are others. I know, certainly, as I said, Bowman has already looked at this, but I would hope that about the world, there are many others that are really starting to cotton on to the fact that, there is this rich information, there is this structured information, there is this complexity narrative that is very much clear in these mythologies and in the belief systems to which they relate, that have in effect been hidden to the greater part of the Western world, to the global north, for a not insignificant amount of time, because we simply hadn't looked. We simply hadn't asked the question, well, could it be that actually, the use, for example, of certain species, such as the pine, references to pine cones or to oaks or to other, I'm speaking to well fire adapted species, could it be that their use is not incidental, that this is not, a mere, accident, that they have chosen to reference these particular species in a particular way? And instead be the fact that, these peoples really understood their landscape. They really understood these species. They understood the interplay between fire and the natural world. They understood the symbiosis, and they conveyed it in these rich tapestries of mythologies and other narratives that are all there, and all along, just waiting for us to take a look. And in doing so, as I said, to understand ourselves better, but also to understand them better, to understand our ancestors better, and to understand the other peoples with whom we share the planet better.
Beautiful. I 100%. I couldn't agree more to what you are saying. Well, I'm aware of the time. Is there anything else you want to add? As in, what are you doing now? And if people maybe want to look at some of the other work or media, are there any specific places?
Yeah, well, I decided I'd actually build a website for the thesis. The reason being that I wanted to make it as accessible as possible. And so, although it will be bumped into the same old usual suspects, the research gates and the academia and so forth,
Hmm.
um, I've built its own standalone site. On there is the text. I haven't actually added in the images yet, which is principally a download issue. It's because obviously the more the more I build out the site with imagery and so forth, the potentially slower the download is, and I don't want to be creating a cumbersome site. So It's just the text at the moment, but it's all there. And you can find that if you go to Panarchic Codex. The site will also have, it's got an ongoing interview series that I've started, which is to further build out some of the conversations that I started in the thesis, as well as to bring awareness to some of the characters who I've discussed in their work, because, as I said, I reference Bowman, but there are many others who are, their works are extraordinary and fascinating. And I really would hope that very many beyond the fire sciences and fire ecology community would start to read them, because I think there's immense value to be found there. There will also be a podcast series that's starting next month, which essentially I'm migrating the thesis into audio, and that is again to make it yet more accessible. They that are hard of sight or that are reliant on audio media alone, and there will be updates on the work. Unfortunately, obviously, because of the lockdown, any field research or indeed even lab research at the moment is it too is on lockdown, because can't physically get out there and do it. So the emphasis is very much on publishing, but it's all there. And there's also the social media has just started going, so that's just starting to roll for anyone that is interested. And I hope that a lot of the work, it is highly speculative, and it is working with ideas that are very novel. But of course, one of the primary underlying reasons for that is because I want to provoke. I want to bring people's attention to possibilities that either weren't on the radar or were ignored for one or another reason. And more generally, what I've been doing is I've been working transdisciplinary. So you'll have heard in that conversation I was jumping between different subjects. What I would say today that are working in this space is, when you're thinking to not merely how you structure your work, and it's quite a task to work transdisciplinary, because of course you've got to, invariably you've got to have a wider literary and general awareness of your domain, because you're working with not one, but you're working with many subjects. But also, one of the big challenges, I think, not merely for researchers in the particular areas that I'm working, but more generally in the transdisciplinary space, is that it is quite difficult to find places that really hit the sweet spot for reaching the audiences that you want to reach. In that, yes, you have lots of journals that are dedicated to this or to that discipline, and within of the academic world, they tend to be quite narrow in their content, the discussions, and actually within of their audiences. And of course, in theory, you could write 1,000,001 papers that goes into 1,000,001 journals and, populate all of them. But actually, we all have time limitations. And so another of the reasons that I actually built a site to host this work was because I was aware that at the moment there actually wasn't that sweet spot. There wasn't somewhere that really hit the nail on the head of where I was looking to take this research. And so I thought, I'll build an open access site. We'll see how it goes. And actually, I've had a pretty good response. But feedback would be good. If folks jump on and they find something that's particularly interesting, or if there's something that is a bit niggly, then let me know. As I said, the issue with the images is one of download speeds, and I might be able to mitigate that through some other fashion. But feedback would be great, and I hope that anyone who does take the time to drop by at least finds it interesting, even if they don't agree with all of the points that are made.
I will put all the links for sure underneath the podcast. Lisa, thank you so much. This definitely was one of the best hours I've had for last week. So thanks a lot for the conversation.
Oh, it's been a pleasure as always.
Same. Thank you.
Take care. Bye for now.
Bye, people.